Welcome, everyone, to our panel discussion titled Serving Up Power, Hospitality Worker Organizing in Los Angeles. This panel is generously supported by the California Center for Ethics and Policy, the Digital Humanities Consortium, and the Special Projects for Improving the Classroom Experience Award at Cal Poly Pomona. My name is Dr. Brady Collins. I am a fellow with the California Center for Ethics and Policy, Digital Humanities Consortium, and I'm very excited to be the facilitator host today for our panel. This is the first in a series of panels this semester that will examine the role of unions, advocates, and other economic justice groups in ongoing political and organizing fights that will shape the future of work in the Los Angeles region. And I have with us three fantastic panelists for the discussion today. We have with us Juan Munoz, political coordinator with Unite Here Local 11, Jeremy Blasey, General Counsel for Unite Here Local 11 and lecturer at UCLA School of Law and Loyola Law School, where he teaches courses on labor law and organizing. And last but not least, Nick Stewart Block, Senior Research and Policy Analyst at the Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy, or LANE. So thank you all for being here. So what I'm going to do is run through a series of questions to kind of orient us to what serving up power means for Unite Here, for LANE, for some of these ongoing fights in Los Angeles today. I want to start by kind of really zooming out. And so I'm going to start with you, Juan, and ask, can you tell us, in short, what is a union? And what does it do for workers?
Yeah. So thank you, Dr. Collins. Nick told me that I have to be a good model student and use appropriate titles here. Hi, everyone. At its core, a union is about simply workers coming together and building an organization together that gives them more power and more say, really focused on their job and their workplace, where they will have the opportunity to be able to collectively bargain, right, for wages, benefits, healthcare, a decent retirement, and really the concept collectively bargain, right, just means that the workers unite and form a collective so that they can bring more demand, more power to their demands in their workplace, right? Individually, it's a little bit tougher to negotiate as an individual worker, but the idea being that when we all come together, we inherently have more power and more say and role in those conditions that we're fighting for. So I'll just say that for now.
Yeah, thank you. And if I can ask a little bit, deeper on that, when you say, unions build worker power, how do they yield that power? Kind of what does that look like if their employer is not doing what they would like them to do, if their rights are being violated? How do workers demonstrate their power once they're in a union?
Yeah. So there's a lot of formal process, right, in that bargaining relationship, right? Fundamentally, the thing that a union can achieve is a collective bargaining agreement, right? Which is essentially a contract between an employer and the workers, and it lays out a whole host of things that they seek to accomplish, right? And there's a lot more to this, but workers under federal law are allowed to the legal term, right, is concerted activity, right? But they can and maybe folks are more familiar through it via strikes, picketing, right? Delegations. All those are protected activity that workers can do collectively to sort of give more voice and more power to their demands.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. And so once in a union, these concerted activities, these protected activities, give them more power than if they were not in a union, right? So thank you. And, with that said, can you tell us a little bit as well about hospitality workers? Like, who are these workers? What is the hospitality industry? And, where do these folks work? What is a typical workday kind of look like for them?
Yeah. So Unite Here Local 11 we're the Hospitality Workers Union here in Southern California. So our union is about 32,000 members. The vast majority of which live in LA and OC. Work in LA and Orange counties. Our local also merged a couple of years ago with a sister local in Arizona. So we are also in the state of Arizona. And Local 11 just signifies, the geographic area that our particular local in the union represents. So we belong to Unite Here, which is an international union that is across the country. And represents over 300,000 workers overall in the hospitality industry. So about half of our membership is in what we call food service, commercial food service, and that is a wide variety of workplaces, right? From private universities to convention centers, sports arenas, and airports. To explain that more close to Cal Poly Pomona, right? So on the food service side, we represent the workers at the Ontario airport, right? The folks that cook the food and work in the retail shops inside the terminals. We also represent airline catering, right? The folks that prepare the meals that you consume on your flight when you're leaving from any of the airports. In the private university space, we have the Claremont colleges. We represent the dining hall workers and as well as at the University of La Verne and Whittier College. And then we also represent folks in sports arenas and convention centers, including at the Toyota Arena and Convention Center. In the food service space, we represent folks from cooks to servers to bartenders. And then, the other half of our union, and perhaps what we're most known for is the hotel side of our union, right? So about half of our membership is in hotels. Close to Cal Poly Pomona, we're actually in a fight, and we'll talk some more about this. But the DoubleTree Ontario is the only union hotel in San Bernardino and Riverside counties. So that's our main shop there. But most recently, we just won a contract and a fight at the Sheraton Pomona Fairplex. So not that far from Cal Poly Pomona. On the hotel side, in addition to cooks, bartenders, and servers, we also represent, of course, the heart of our union, which is housekeepers. And our membership is largely women of color. We're a very immigrant union, and the work that we do really is diverse, right? From really the idea is to cover for our union to cover all aspects of someone visiting our region, from the time that they board the plane to the time that they attend a convention or event or show during their visit. So yeah.
Very good. Yeah. So, I think what you just described, from when someone gets on a plane, goes to a show, gets back on the plane. I mean, it sounds like we're talking a lot about tourists, right? And the tourism industry as being fundamentally served by hospitality workers. And I know we're going to talk more about tourism in Los Angeles and how this all connects with the work y'all are doing. But before we get there, I know you are a political coordinator at Local 11, and you were telling us about the collective bargaining and the contracts, but I know Local 11 and many other unions do a lot more than just the worker organizing and the collective bargaining. So can you tell us a little bit more about your own work at Local 11? How does a Local 11 get involved in politics, and what are the big challenges or opportunities on the horizon for Local 11's work in that arena?
I now work as a political coordinator. I've been all in all with the union for 7 years, and so have really mostly been in this role in the last 3 years or so. Our union subscribes to the belief of what we call what's described in academia as social justice unionism, right? Believing that the labor movement has a responsibility to be involved and be engaged in things beyond just sort of the bread and butter of unions, which is just negotiating contracts and wages and benefits, right? And we believe that because our members are not only defined by their work, right? They're perceived by their identities, which is, again, largely women of color, immigrants, right? They have kids, and they take their kids to our public schools, and so they have a right to care about the quality of public education that they receive, right? Our members commute and take transit, right? And so therefore we view that as also being a part of our work. Of course, the core issue that I think that we've really done a lot of work on is around housing. We recognize that despite a lot of the progress that our union has made over the years, it's incredibly expensive to live in our region. It's a responsibility to not only fight for livable wages, but wages that really allow workers to live in the communities near where they work. And that was certainly the core message of our 2023 strike, which I'm sure we'll talk some about. Underlying concept is that government, unfortunately, does not work for working people. And it is a system that is by design, in many instances, intended to keep people out, and it is incredibly hard to get workers to be powerful in those decisions. And so our union's belief is that we need to make sure that working people are allowed to effectively participate, that it can't just be the corporations and their lobbyists, that it can't just be technocrats and people that have an expertise in a particular policy matter, but that the lived experiences of workers and how they engage with their government is just as relevant to the government and to the political process. And so everything that I do is towards that end, whether it's engaging in land use fights, whether it's engaging in public policy fights. And a large part of how we do that is through California's direct democracy powers, right? The powers of initiative, referenda, and recalls in certain instances, really making sure that our members walk and are part of endorsing and supporting particular candidates that would advance what's good for working people.
But yeah, I heard land use, housing, transportation, education, right? It sounds like Local 11 is looking at the challenges that its members face across the board, right? And trying to get involved politically to shape, right, their lived experiences, the quality of their education, the quality of their housing. With that said, I want to kind of bring it over to Jeremy a little bit. Jeremy, you have written a lot about this recently, about Local 11's modern history. You have an article that was put out recently titled "How Hospitality Workers Built Power and Changed Politics." So I want to hear a little bit about that, and wanted to ask if you can tell us, before we talk about how hospitality workers have changed politics, of what the political landscape here in LA and California looks like more broadly and how it's impacted low-wage workers.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having us. It sounds like a great course, and wish I could have taken it when I was a student myself. So, I think the first question was about how the political landscape has affected low-wage industries. I think the story of California is a really interesting one and maybe holds some lessons for the country. When I was in high school, the political environment in California looked in some ways like it does today at a national level, with extreme amounts of nativism and xenophobia. The governor of California back then was Pete Wilson, who ran on an explicitly anti-immigrant platform. His marquee initiative was called Proposition 187, which would have barred undocumented people from going to school, from going to public hospitals. So a politics very much like what we see from Donald Trump and the MAGA, movement today. It was in some ways really dark times for immigrants and for people who cared about them in Los Angeles back then. But the story didn't end there. That was really the beginning of a revolution among low-wage workers, immigrant workers, particularly in Los Angeles. And that, the union that I represent, the one I represent, Unite Here Local 11, underwent its own sort of revolution from being a union that was very dismissive of immigrant workers, hostile in some ways, like, meetings didn't take place in Spanish, contracts weren't translated to Spanish, union reps didn't talk to the workers much. But there was this upswell of organizing among immigrant workers and organizers like Maria Elena Durazo, who helped lead a transformation of the union at that time to one that, instead of treating immigrant workers as kind of like a problem or in the broader narrative, scapegoated for causing wages to be lower, instead embraced workers and said, these workers deserve rights and they, can be powerful and important players in the labor movement. And then made that happen. And from, on a shop by shop basis, organized workers, immigrant workers, to become leaders in their communities, leaders in their union, completely transform the union. Unite Here Local 11 that we represent, similar thing happened with the janitors union. Some, very famous strikes that were put down with violence happened here in Century City in particular. And that revolution that happened here had, enormous consequences for California, and for the people, today who live here. It has meant that the union movement has been revitalized. It has more energy than it had before, has been much more creative. And so we've seen in California, the percent of workers who are represented by unions that have the benefits that come with a union contract, like just cause and healthcare and better wages, much higher in California than the rest of the country. In fact, the rate is about twice as high in the private sector in California than the rest of the country. And we've been able to do a lot of things in terms of raising wages through contracts, through legislation, and so on, which we can get into if you want. But I think that story of what's happened here, hopefully could, be a story that's told elsewhere in the rest of the country in these dark times.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, a lot of history there, important history, and kind of given what challenges Local 11 was facing, right, in that history you just gave us, kind of what have they done to respond to these challenges? What has worked? What challenges remain? I mean, I know you mentioned that they've been able to increase union density tremendously in California, attempts to raise the wage. But what are the challenges that remain? What's kind of left to be done here?
Well, unfortunately, an awful lot remains to be done. But I will, maybe before getting to the challenges, just flag a little bit more on some of the accomplishments, just to highlight that just a little bit more. Juan talked about the power of, workers taking action through collective bargaining and, workplace activism. we workers across Los Angeles waged what was the largest strike in history in the hotel sector in 2023 and 2024. And as a result of that, managed to win wage increases of 40% over the course of their contract. So housekeepers' wages going from $25 an hour to $35 an hour. Along with many other improvements, including protections for immigrant workers, pathways from people impacted by the carceral system into our industry, all sorts of things. So it's been transformative for workers that benefit from a union contract. Unfortunately, the reality is most workers don't have a union yet. And so there is an awful lot to be done in terms of organizing the unorganized, so they have these protections and these rights. And, our union is very dedicated to trying to expand the power of the union to as many workers as possible. That's like a huge focus of the union. And, we're not the only union that believes in that. So there's a lot to be done. One of the things that, and I think Nick maybe could get into more detail on this perhaps, but one of the things we've been doing over the last several years is working to enact a minimum wage for tourism workers that mirrors what workers have won through their contracts, but in the rest of the industry. So we call it the Olympic wage, and the law would raise wages for all workers in the industry, in the tourism industry, to $30 an hour by 2028 when the Olympics come. It'll be maybe the most important legacy project of the Olympics. And so we've been in a campaign for several years now. We won the law. It took 2 years to get passed. Then the airlines and the Hotel Association tried to referendize the law, which paused its implementation. The idea is they gathered signatures to put it on the ballot. They attempted to gather signatures to put it on the ballot to undo it. This remarkable upswelling of support and organizing occurred throughout the city, where people said, no, we're not going to sign a petition to lower wages, even if you're telling us, lies about it, which is what happened. Nick may remember the number better than me, but I think it was more than 100,000 people, when they learned about the true impact of this referendum initiative, withdrew their signatures. And ultimately, the airlines and the hotel companies did not have enough signatures to put it on the ballot. And so it is now the law in the city of LA. Workers, the minimum currently is $22.50, but will again go up to $30 an hour by 2028. There's also, in addition to that, a healthcare credit, so that if workers aren't given healthcare at work, they get paid an additional amount so they can pay for it. But even now, the industry is still not resigned to actually raising worker wages. So we're continuing to have to campaign to make sure that the city council doesn't water it down, as the industry has been demanding through some rather unseemly tactics. So that's one thing that I think needs to happen, but that's only part of the story. If your wages go up, but you're just handing that money over to your landlord, which raised your rent, you haven't really seen a wage increase. So another area that I think is maybe of the greatest importance to our members and to people across the city and the region is dealing with our housing crisis, where people are having to commute sometimes 2 hours each way to get to their jobs because there's not enough affordable housing where in the communities where workers work. So that's a big priority of ours right now, is to find ways to build more housing that's affordable for working class people. And if you want, we can talk more about what that has involved. But I think that's another huge issue. And then, of course, the broader situation where Trumpism has villainizing immigrant workers, and we've seen the violence in Minnesota. We've seen, just outrageous, instances of authoritarianism and violence against peaceful protesters. And so I think, we need to, very critically continue the work of pushing back against those kinds of nativist policies and the violence we're seeing from the government. So that's
Yeah, no, thank you. And I know you've written extensively about this, given what you've seen happened with Local 11, how they've kind of reached beyond the boundaries of what a lot of, traditionally unions have done to get a lot more engaged in some of these other fights. What would you say, other unions can learn from this Local 11 model?
That's an interesting question. I think it would be presumptuous for us to tell any other union what to do. I think what our union has done very well, perhaps better than most, has been to build real worker leadership. There's this idea of the worker committee is sort of a mantra within the union. There's this idea that the organizer organizes the committee organizes the rest of the workers, and the committee is, what that means is workers in their own shops developing leadership, so that they can wage campaigns, for whatever their needs are in the workplace, in a smart, creative, disciplined way. And so this sort of bottom-up leadership development program is just absolutely critical. It's where our power comes from. It's the power of ordinary people sort of seeing themselves as leaders and seeing themselves as people that, could wield power, whether it's, in their workplace on behalf of their coworkers, whether it's in politics. I think that's the one renewable resource that, that progressive forces have in this country that's untapped, which is the leadership capacity of everyday people. What I really love about the labor movement, what I love about the union that I represent is, the Marriotts and Hiltons of the world see, an immigrant in her 40s, or 50s or 60s or 70s or maybe even 80s, who's good for, changing the beds in hotel rooms and cleaning the toilet and cleaning the rest of the bathrooms in the public areas. But what the union, sees in that same person is somebody who could be a leader in her workplace, could lead delegations, could get involved in politics, could testify, at public hearings, can meet with legislators, could even run for office. Hugo Soto Martinez is my council member, and he, started his career as a house person at a hotel in downtown LA, and now he's a council member. Betty Guardado in Phoenix, Arizona, where our local also represents workers, is the vice mayor. She started her career as a housekeeper. So it's that untapped power that everyday people have when they're challenged and given, training and leadership and pushed and, believed in. I think that's where the power of the labor movement comes from. And when it's done well, it's enormously powerful.
Yeah, thank you. And of course, you mentioned Maria Elena Durazo earlier in the discussion, and now senator, right? So
that's right.
And, I think we've been dancing around the subject a little bit. We've heard tourism workers, tourism rising. I want to get into that a little bit more. I want to turn it over to Nick to talk a bit about Lane as well, right? We're not just talking about Local 11. There are many other organizations a part of this broader fight. So Nick, can you tell us a bit about Lane? I know Lane works a lot with Local 11, probably even calls itself, part of the labor movement, but I know it does a lot of other great work as well. So what is Lane?
Yeah, Lane, first of all, thanks for having me here. Lane, LA Alliance for New Economy, actually grew out of a lot of the movements that Jeremy talked about in the 90s. So LA's economy was transforming, it was deindustrializing. It was also becoming like a kind of mega event capital. It just had the '84 Olympics, and there was a lot of, low wage jobs and exploitation, particularly in the tourism sector. And so Lane emerged out of this with like leaders like Maria Elena Durazo and Miguel Contreras and Madeline Janis. They formed Lane. It was first called the Tourism Industry Development Council, as a kind of to engage in like policy advocacy to raise standards in the tourism industry and to build out community coalitions. And that's all continued like through to today. And a lot of Lane's work has been about working with unions like Local 11 and SEIU, and building out community coalitions of like community partners that also recognize that like we need good wages, we need community benefits, we need like these huge investments in infrastructure that are like integral to the tourism industry. I mean, we're talking about billions. Did that go towards like LAX's expansion, the convention center, hotel development? That these need to be, good jobs that pay living wages and health benefits. And so part of Lane's role in that has been, trying to change the narrative around what these industries should be and what providing good jobs can mean. And that these are positive things. I mean, so often, when workers go to City Hall and with unions and talk about like getting higher wages, the industry will counter with, how disastrous that'll be, how like no one will have jobs anymore, development will stall, businesses will leave. And I think a lot of Lane's role is kind of inoculating against that kind of catastrophic narrative that just isn't true. I mean, there's been, as Jeremy and Juan have talked about, there's been huge victories because of unions like Local 11 and what they've been able to achieve. And like the industry is still very strong. And yeah.
Yeah, and I know, there's a great report from Lane called Why the Sky Never Fell, or The Sky Never Fell, right? Because I think that's kind of the phrase that a lot of corporations use in trying to develop an argument against raising the wage, right? That, if we do this, the economy is going to collapse. No one's going to have a job anymore because everyone's going to leave. What does that report tell us? Like, is there any merit to this kind of argument from Lane's work?
Yeah, I mean, we looked at, so working on the Olympic wage campaign that Jeremy talked about, really from the beginning when it was introduced in early 2023, we heard those exact narratives of, this would, hotels would have to cut jobs, development would stall, profits would decline, no one would ever invest in LA. So we thought, if we wanted to look if there was any merit, and so we kind of went through the historical record, and because of all the policy gains in the 90s and 2000s, we had a lot of kind of evidence to look at. So we looked specifically in 2014, LA City passed a hotel worker minimum wage law, and since then it hadn't kept up with inflation, so we updated it. But we were able to look kind of historically. Okay, the industry was saying then as well, if you pass this, we're going to, jobs are going to be lost, hours are going to be cut, development's going to stop, profits are going to decline. And we took each of those claims at face value one by one and just used data to evaluate whether they're true. It turns out none of them were true. So it was really like a kind of brief historical analysis, which looked at the 5 years after the policy passed. So until COVID, which obviously changed the tourism industry more broadly, and looked at, how did LA compare with, let's say, New York City, which didn't have a similar law on the books? How did LA compare with San Diego? LA actually in that time, I think for 2 years was had the most hotel development of any city in the world. It also had the most job growth of any of these cities. And so it was, this was a useful tool to share with council members. I mean, they were constantly kind of berated by industry lobbyists saying that, if you do this, everyone's going to leave. But the reality is these industries are strongly subsidized. They have pretty large profit margins. And since it's passed, LA's tourism industry seems fine. There's nothing to suggest that these widespread job losses have occurred. We also borrowed from studies in the fast food sector, because there's the $20 an hour fast food minimum wage that passed a couple years ago, and economists at UC Berkeley showed the same thing. There just was not an association of job loss because of it. Workers saw real gains.
Yeah, no, and I think on top of that, I think a common argument we'll often hear is, well, California's got such a high minimum wage, LA's got such a high minimum wage. Isn't that enough? But what is this idea of a living wage? Can you talk a little bit about that and kind of what is that trying to capture that a minimum wage doesn't?
Yeah. Living wages as a policy started in the 90s. I think Baltimore was maybe the first one, but LA's was in 1997 at the airport, which Lane and other unions were a part of. And it's really the recognition that the minimum isn't enough, that there needs to be, something a little higher. And often the living wage will include a healthcare credit or incentive to make sure, just recognizing that like a person's need is not just like what wages can buy. It's healthcare. It's like now in LA's there's also like time off included in it, and often you see these living wage policies start with like city contracting policies. So at airports, San Francisco's had one for many years. LA, of course.
The Olympics are coming, right? Tourism is about to explode once again here in Los Angeles. We've heard a little about the Olympic wage campaign, right? The city council passed something, but kind of what's going on with that right now? Are there still some hurdles that the campaign has to get over in order to make sure workers see some of the benefits of the Olympics?
Yeah, well, I think to what both Jeremy and Juan have already pointed out, that the housing crisis is really still a major presence for like working families in LA, and there's this issue of even getting higher wages doesn't address the issue when your landlord takes most of that wage growth. So part of our Fair Games campaign, Lane is working with Local 11 and a coalition of other unions and community groups is demanding like the Olympics Committee, commit money to go to a housing fund for working people. And a lot of that is in recognition that these mega events have put enormous strain on the housing market. So you see like Airbnb, for instance, uses mega events like this to kind of leverage getting more hosts, and that takes housing off the market for renters and drives up rent. And so that's a big area we've been looking into and working on, as well as we're also advocating for what we've been calling the overpaid CEO tax, which is a ballot measure which would tax companies whose CEOs make more than 50 times what their median worker in LA makes. Most of the money would go into a housing fund, also street and sidewalk repair, after school programming, a grocery store program. And a lot of that is just in recognition that LA is a kind of mega event capital, is the site of so much, retail and commerce, generates a huge amount of profits, and Angelenos should see the benefit of that.
Are they saying the sky is going to fall down if that tax passes as well? Is that already happening?
We haven't heard as much yet because we're still working to get it on the ballot, which I can talk a bit about as well. But I'm sure we will.
I'm sure we will as well.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. So what I want to do now is just kind of go back to Juan, ask each of you the same question in turn. Again, hearing a lot about how much has been done, the progress that's been made, but also these big challenges that remain, right? The exorbitant price of housing, the wealth and income inequality, the fact that we've got, a federal administration that doesn't want to support working families, immigrant workers. Wanted to ask Juan if you can tell us, in spite of all of that, what gives you hope about the future of worker organizing in Los Angeles, and of course, what gives you concern?
Yeah. In some ways, I'll start with the later half of that question, right? With what gives me concern, because I think you enumerated some of it. Obviously, as Jeremy cited, the terror that Los Angeles is facing at the hands of ICE and immigration officials is really, really a cause for concern. I think that more than the actual folks that are being disappeared from our lives, it's really about instilling a real fear in the community, in particular in a city like Los Angeles. I don't think it was in any accident that we saw the worst of it here. Los Angeles, because of our history, we've changed the culture, we've changed the conversation in our city, changed the dynamics of power, and we really were under assault by this federal administration. And I think that is really shaken a lot of people, especially those that are unorganized, right? That do not belong to a union, that are not tied to a broader organization, because they I think will have even more fear to just be more active and engaged in broader civic life. It really is a stunning. It's just a personal betrayal from their government, right? And I think like we're going to have a lot of work to be able to undo that in folks. So I'll say that, and then just really on housing and the cost of living. It really is a cause for concern, right? In our membership, and again, to come to a point that we said earlier, right? Even despite all the wins, housing is incredibly expensive in Southern California, and so we've seen more and more people have to move to the Inland Empire, to the high desert, right? To these more distant communities. Where we have not done as much of the work to shape those communities, and so the politics and the way that those communities function are a little bit different, and so we're going to have to do some work there, and I think it is a little bit of a concern, right? If people cannot vote in the places where near where they work, like it dilutes some of their impact on some of the questions that we've talked about. But I think that at the same time, obviously Los Angeles has not been passive as we've seen all this, and certainly as Nick has talked about, I think that there's a lot of policy efforts underway, right? The overpaid CEO tax, I think it gives me a lot of hope as a funding source. Other things that we've done and succeeded on, right? Measure ULA in Los Angeles, which is dubbed as the mansion tax, right? Our union helped collect half of the signatures there to place that measure on the ballot, which is a critical funding source to building more housing for folks. Measure A on the last election, right? A countywide measure to also fund the LA County Housing Affordable Housing Solutions Agency. I think that there's just a lot of opportunity for unions and our broader movement to play a role in the solutions, right? And then certainly on the immigration front, right? I think it's also unlocked a sense of urgency in a lot of people in getting more engaged and getting more involved. And I think that any protest, any action, any mobilization is just an opportunity to be able to talk to more people, right? You don't find the next, Hugo Soto Martinez or Betty Guardado or Maria Elena Durazo just sitting in a room waiting for them to show up, right? You find them in opportunities for them to mobilize and lead and take ownership over their fights, and so that always inspires me is that we're going to find more people coming out of this fight. So yeah.
I was worried you weren't going to get to what gives you hope, because there's a lot to be worried about, but I hear you. Jeremy, what about you? What gives you cause for concern? Take either one first, whichever one bubbles to the surface.
Well, I'll start with the negative. It's hard not to be concerned when you have like masked men with guns, marching through our streets and kidnapping people, which is, what's really happening. On the other hand, I am hopeful, and first, I think many of the same reasons that Juan described, and I'll just give a sort of a particular frame for it, which is that, the MAGA movement, Trumpism, the attacks on immigrants, nativism, it all comes from a place of scapegoating, a group unfairly for a very real circumstance, which is that people across the country are struggling, and in the 80s or 90s, it was a different scapegoat. It was like, welfare queens, which was code word for, a black person. There's always a scapegoat because, those in positions of power don't want ordinary people to reflect on the massive changes that have happened in the economy at their expense. What we've seen over the last 40 years is an incredibly disruptive, upward redistribution of wealth. Wages used to track inflation very closely. The minimum wage used to track productivity extremely closely. So, as workers became more productive, as companies became more profitable, workers got to share, an equivalent amount of the pie. And that broke down. And instead, what we've seen is wages stagnating while corporate profits have skyrocketed. You see that in the compensation of CEOs, which, in the 60s, the average CEO compensation was like 22 to 1 compared to the median worker. And now it's like 300 to 1. So while wages are stagnating, companies are doing great. And now not the 1%, the 0.1% now controls something like half of the wealth in the country. That's resulted in, or I should say, I think the statistic it's more wealth than the entire bottom half of households, the 0.1%. What that's meant for regular people is they're struggling. And so they want to blame somebody. And the poison that Trump and, the MAGA movement is selling is it's the immigrants' fault. That's the narrative. And it's been very effective. It got them elected. I think that you were seeing their overreach, resulting in lower support. I'm happy to see that. But it's an effective form of poison for the populace. What gives me hope is that I believe the politics we have going here and what we and the many allies that we work closely with have here is in an alternative way of politics, of doing politics and seeing the world that has the promise of not just making things better for people here in LA, but if we can expand this model of grassroots organizing and corporate accountability, progressive taxation policy, we could transform the politics nationally. We did polling on our overpaid CEO tax, which again would tax companies that pay their CEOs, many multiples of what ordinary workers make. Goes up from 50 to 1 and escalates in the increased tax if they pay them 1,000 to 1. And our companies that pay 1,000 to 1, Starbucks pays its CEO last year something like $90 million. And you know what a barista makes. We did polling, and 78% of people support the idea of making companies that are contributing to inequality pay for the needs that the community has, for housing and after-school care and the other, things that Nick talked about. And I think that politics has a chance of overcoming the nativism we're seeing across the country. But we need, because it's naming the real, for lack of a better word, the real villain in this, which is, the concentration of wealth in the hands of a tiny, tiny, tiny number of people at the expense of the great many. So I'm hopeful that kind of, political movement can continue to build and take hold across more and more of the country. But again, it always requires the, everyday people being involved to make it happen. So that's what gives me hope.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Nick, how about you? Last but not least.
Yeah. So I'll echo. I think it's what's on everyone's minds, like very similar to Juan and Jeremy. I think just what we're seeing across the country is very scary, and is just like, sliding towards like authoritarianism, I think, pretty quickly. Not that it's like destined to be there or can't be stopped, but I think, I lived in Minneapolis for very many years, and I think what we saw in LA over the summer was pretty horrific. And I think in particular in regards to LA, I think things like the Olympics can be a big major inflection point, because that's going to see, even in years when the Trump administration wouldn't be governing, would see a huge federal presence, and I think, takes on a more sinister quality now that he will be overseeing it. And so I think those, there's just, terrible human consequences to what they're doing, and they're willing to push against all kinds of like rules of law, human decency, and so that's, obviously scary, because each day they push in a new way that causes people to suffer. What gives me hope is a few things. One is that, like, I think, just like in a very anecdotal way, I see people on my Facebook feed that I had known my whole life who aren't very political, who are now engaged, from seeing what's going on, which it really does take more people. It can't just be the dedicated, lefties that push this. It really has to be a broad movement. So I think that I find that very heartening, and I think all the on the ground organizing that's gone on in LA and elsewhere across the country, and Chicago, Minneapolis, all kinds of cities, to protect communities with the ICE raids, I think has been really powerful. I think too, and Juan talked about this, I think just like the use of like the initiative and what we're doing with the overpaid CEO tax, but other groups are using this at the state, to tax billionaires, I think is really powerful, because it gives voters a chance to like directly interface with the political process and vote for things which are in our interest, which is to make sure the billionaires pay their fair share, that we get healthcare, that we get housing, that we get cities with strong budgets to like fix sidewalks and whatnot. And so I find that very exciting, knowing that I think, especially in California and especially in Southern California, there is, I think, a real appetite for progressive change. And that it's just finding ways to unlock that. And I think that the initiative process is what we're doing with overpaid CEO, what folks are doing with the billionaire tax, I think is very exciting.
I'd like to open it up to any of the folks here in attendance. If you have questions for any of the panelists, please, I'd ask you either type it in the chat or use the raise the hand function so we can field some questions. So whoever would like to go first, please. Okay, we've got a question from someone here in the chat. What skills are most valuable if you want to work in labor rights or public policy? What can we start developing now as students? Great question. Anyone want to take a first stab at that?
I will just say that the beautiful thing about the labor movement and the broader social justice movement is that you have a skill, we will find a place for you, whether it's if you're interested in comms, we've got comms, right? If you're interested in research and doing some more technical work, we've got a place for you. If you're on your a path to law school, Jeremy's got a place for you, right? There's no particular scope, because I think the movement is all about bringing everyone's unique talents and strengths and putting them to use for our broader fights.
We need you, the labor movement. That's they need a sign like that or something.
That's a good idea.
Anyone else? Question from Alex, go ahead.
This presentation was so awesome. Thank you all so much for coming. This has been super cool. One thing that I felt like it was kind of a theme coming out of several of your discussions about grounds for optimism is there are some regimes when they pivot towards authoritarianism where they are like much more subtle about it, and they'll like take a controlling stake in the media without sort of making a big deal out of it, and they'll so I feel like one thing that we have like kind of lucked out in is just how like over the top and occasionally, let's just say stupid, that like just so heavy handed in the in the repression or whatever in some cases. So like it seems like if you're doing it in a much more behind the scenes kind of way, you're much less likely to elicit backlash and anger. Whereas when they're so out in front and they're even if it's just something as simple as like just taking Jimmy Kimmel off the air, but obviously like all the stuff that's happening, the treatment of protesters and so on, that they're it's a certain kind of overplaying of their hand, which I almost feel lucky that our turn towards authoritarianism is so heavy-handed because it's so on full display, and then it's creating new opportunities to organize. So I was just curious about your thoughts about that.
I totally agree with you, Alex. I think that their overreach has been just so outrageous that it's impossible for even people that are not that engaged in politics to see. I think what happened in Minnesota is profoundly horrible. I mean, the murder of people on the streets, but also very beautiful in the uprising of people. The people that were in the streets protesting in Minnesota were not like your dyed-in-the-wool activist types. I mean, I'm sure those people were there too, but it was like the entire community, could see what was going on. People that, I think there were many people whose politics were probably rather conservative that were out there too. 100 priests got arrested in sub-zero weather. So, the kind of outrageous violence that we're seeing it's not going unnoticed. And I think that sort of the outrage among ordinary people is pretty high right now. So I'm hopeful that will mean, the pendulum will swing back. I can't believe we have 3 more years of this, but but maybe the midterms will at least, create some check on the, the president's power.
The violence and also the immediate, desperate attempt to do ridiculous media spin where they were like, he was a domestic terrorist. It was
completely absurd.
It was just so whatever you thought of the video, there's just no way that you could get that far,
Exactly.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Anyone else? Any questions for any of our panelists?
Yeah, I have a question. I'm not too sure are there any other preparations that hospitality unions are making for the Olympics, or not even hospitality in specific, but yeah.
Well, so it's a great question, Eric, and the answer is quite a lot. So our union has lined up more than 100 contracts to expire earlier in the year 2028, meaning that they'll be in a position to go on strike when the Olympics comes. And we're not the only union that's done that. Maybe Juan or Nick has the full list, but I'm aware of, the auto workers and the folks who work for the city as engineers, and I don't know who else. There's
public sector workers, public school teachers, grocery store workers.
Mm-hmm. So a huge swath of the labor movement has lined things up so that their members will be in a position to go on the streets, if the Olympics doesn't, or their employers and the beneficiaries of the Olympics are, not willing to share the spoils with regular people. The auto workers sort of started a call for a general strike on May Day of 2028. And a lot of times, people like to throw around the phrase general strike. There was actually something akin to a general strike in Minnesota, which is very rare. But it is a phrase that is bandied around by people that don't really know what is involved in actually waging one sometimes. And this feels different. Like there's so much of the city is ready to walk out. I think that we're going to see something, quite remarkable happen, that hopefully will, change the dynamics. And that's in the lead up to the Olympics, which will, sort of send a warning signal, I think. Juan or Nick, do you want to add? Or Brady? Professor Collins, excuse me.
Stop. Go ahead, Nick or Juan.
I just wanted to add that we have also we've talked about pieces of that agenda, but we put our fair games sort of policy proposal. Maybe that's not the actual catchy comms approved name, but we've proposed, we've put forward that we want a ban on short-term rentals like Airbnb and VRBO. Airbnb is a international sponsor of the Olympics, and their co-founder literally works for the Trump administration, Joe Gebbia. And we've also demanded that we want a halt of immigration enforcement in our city. We want the IOC to directly contribute money towards the housing crisis, and a whole host of other demands, and in part, the vehicle to getting all of these things is where we actually started, right? Is that the power of unions is that we have the power to strike. And as Jeremy just mentioned, there are many unions that have lined up and have pledged to line up their contracts if they're still in negotiations to expire just before the Olympics. And so I think it's a real opportunity, and I think it's exciting that there's just a lot of momentum to get that.
Well, thank you so much for answering that question. That really informed me a lot on what the unions are doing in preparation for the Olympics, and kind of also spoke to what I heard Jeremy say about how the legacy of the Olympics is going to be something that unions are going to have a good benefit from, hopefully.
A lot more fights to be had, right? On all fronts. And so with that, I know that we've got busy organizers, members of the labor movement here. I'm going to wrap the panel discussion. Thank you so much, Nick, Juan, Jeremy, for joining us today. Thank you for everyone for attending, your questions. I'm happy to share out contact information for some of our panelists. If anyone has additional questions for them, just reach out. But thank you again. I appreciate your time.